A secret meeting in the scorching Saudi desert that would control your wallet for the next 50 years. A handshake that nobody was allowed to know about. A deal so powerful it made America the richest nation on earth. And now, that deal just expired. What happens next will shock you. Back in July 1974, a plain-looking American military plane landed in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. The person stepping off wasn't some famous politician or high-ranking general. His name was William Simon, and he was America's Treasury Secretary. The newspapers called it a friendly business visit. But here's the truth. It was actually a top-secret emergency mission to rescue America from complete financial disaster. The American dream that had been glowing bright since World War II was about to go dark. America's economy was falling apart. Prices were shooting through the roof. The stock market had just dropped by nearly half. The Vietnam War had ended in total embarrassment. The Watergate mess was about to force President Nixon out of office. But the biggest problem? The American dollar itself was in serious trouble. Just 3 years earlier, Nixon had cut the dollar's connection to gold, basically turning the world's main currency into regular paper with nothing backing it up. Countries around the world were starting to panic. Their central banks were getting rid of dollars as fast as they could. If the dollar crashed completely, America would lose its ability to buy foreign goods, control global events, and pay its massive debts. William Simon had one simple mission: leave Saudi Arabia with an agreement that would replace gold with something the world needed even more: oil. To really understand how desperate this mission was, we need to go back to the disaster of August 15, 1971. This was what people call the Nixon shock. For almost 3 decades, the world's money system had been tied to the American dollar through something called the Bretton Woods Agreement. And that dollar was tied to gold at $35 per ounce. This system worked perfectly as long as America owned most of the planet's gold. But by the late 1960s, paying for the Vietnam War and huge welfare programs forced America to print way more dollars than it had gold to support them. European countries, especially France, could smell something was wrong. They started trading their paper dollars for actual gold bars, emptying America's Fort Knox vault at a scary speed. Facing the nightmare of running completely out of gold, Nixon slammed the gold window shut. He basically broke America's promise to exchange dollars for gold. Just like that, overnight, the dollar became what's called a fiat currency, backed by absolutely nothing except people's trust in a government that was drowning in scandals and economic problems. The dollar's value crashed hard. Oil-selling countries who got paid in these worthless dollars were absolutely furious. Their buying power was disappearing right before their eyes. To get revenge, and boosted by political tensions from the Yom Kippur War, OPEC launched the brutal 1973 oil embargo. Oil prices jumped 4 times higher overnight. Americans waited in endless lines at gas stations. The fantasy of American energy independence shattered into pieces. America suddenly realized it couldn't control the world economy just by making stuff anymore. It desperately needed a new way to stay in control. This was the situation when William Simon sat down for secret talks with Saudi oil minister Sheikh Yamani and King Faisal. The proposal Simon brought was absolutely genius in terms of global power plays. It was an agreement that would lock these 2 countries together for the next 50 years. The terms seemed simple, but they would change everything. Part 1. America's promised the United States would protect the Saudi royal family from every possible threat, foreign enemies like Soviet Russia and Iran, plus any rebels inside their own country. We'd sell them the most cutting-edge weapons on the planet: F-15 fighter jets, missile systems, tanks, military equipment that we previously only gave to our closest allies. We'd modernize their entire country and transform their desert kingdom into an untouchable fortress. Part 2. Saudi Arabia's promise in return. Saudi Arabia would agree to sell all of its oil using only US dollars, not German currency, not Japanese currency, not gold, only American dollars. Even better, Saudi Arabia would use its massive influence in OPEC to force all other oil-producing countries to do exactly the same thing. Part 3. The secret ingredient: Petrodollar recycling. This was the brilliant masterstroke that made everything work. Saudi Arabia was about to make trillions of dollars from selling oil, way more money than their small population could ever possibly spend. Simon secretly arranged for the Saudi central bank to take all those extra dollars and pump them straight back into buying U.S. Treasury bonds. This agreement created what we now call the petrodollar system. It instantly solved America's money crisis. By forcing oil to be sold only in dollars, the U.S. created fake demand for its currency. Every single country on Earth needs oil, which means every single country on Earth needs U.S. dollars to purchase that oil. Japan, Germany, France, Brazil, all of them were forced to pile up dollars in their banks just to keep their economies running. This artificial demand kept the dollar valuable even though it wasn't backed by gold anymore. Basically, the dollar was now backed by black gold instead of yellow gold. As long as the world ran on oil, the world needed dollars. And as long as the world needed dollars, America printed as much money as it wanted to pay its bills without causing crazy inflation, because all those extra dollars got absorbed by the global oil market. The genius of this recycling system is almost impossible to overstate. The money that America spent buying Saudi oil didn't just disappear into thin air. It came right back to Washington to buy American government debt. It was a perfect circle. We printed money to buy oil. The Saudis took that exact money and loaned it back to us to pay for our military, which we then used to protect the Saudis. This allowed the U.S. to spend way more than it earned for decades. It let American shoppers buy cheap products from all over the world, paying with a currency that everyone was forced to accept. It was the ultimate financial privilege on steroids. William Simon had basically turned global demand for U.S. debt into a private money machine. He transformed the OPEC oil cartel from America's enemy into America's personal banker. However, this deal came with one crucial condition: absolute secrecy. King Faisal was terrified that if the Arab world discovered he was secretly funding the U.S. government, which was Israel's main supporter, he'd be overthrown or killed. Sadly, King Faisal was actually assassinated just 1 year later in 1975, though for unrelated reasons. To keep this secret safe, the U.S. Treasury created a special hidden tracking system. Unlike every other country whose ownership of U.S. debt gets publicly reported, Saudi Arabia's holdings were hidden inside a vague category called oil exporters. For 41 years until 2016, the exact amount of U.S. debt owned by Saudi Arabia was classified as a state secret. Treasury officials could actually go to jail for revealing it. This secrecy let the Saudis fund the American empire from the shadows, while still looking like they opposed Israel in public. It was a deal built on lies, power politics, and mutual survival. The 1974 agreement completely changed how the Cold War worked. The Soviet Union had plenty of oil, but they couldn't sell it for dollars the same way because they were locked out of Western banking. The U.S. used the petrodollar system as a weapon to bankrupt the Soviets. By the 1980s, the U.S. convinced the Saudis to pump out massive amounts of oil, which crashed oil prices. This destroyed the Soviet economy that depended on high oil prices, while boosting the U.S. economy that loved cheap energy. The collapse of the USSR was really an economic victory made possible by the power gained in that Jeddah meeting in 1974. William Simon's secret trip was arguably as important as D-Day during World War II. It didn't free Europe, but it freed the U.S. Treasury from normal economic rules. But systems built on specific global conditions don't last forever. The petrodollar deal was based on two big assumptions. First, the U.S. would always be the world's biggest oil buyer, so the Saudis needed us as their customer. Second, the U.S. would always be the unbeatable military power in the Middle East, so the Saudis needed us as their protector. In 2026, both of those assumptions are completely dead. The U.S. now produces more oil than it uses thanks to fracking technology. We don't need Saudi oil anymore, and China is now the world's biggest oil importer. The Saudis need Beijing way more than Washington now. On top of that, America's messy exit from Afghanistan and unwillingness to get involved in recent Middle Eastern conflicts has made the Saudis doubt. American protection, the security for oil, contract is falling apart. This is exactly why we're seeing the rise of what's called the petrol yuan. This is why the Saudis are openly talking about selling oil in currencies besides the dollar. They're basically admitting that the 50-year contract has run out. The consequences of this expiration are absolutely catastrophic for America's ability to borrow money. If this recycling loop breaks, if the Saudis stop buying U.S. government bonds with their oil money, who's going to fund America's massive deficit spending? The Federal Reserve. That creates hyperinflation, American taxpayers? That means severe budget cuts. The 1974 deal was the engine powering American wealth for half a century. That engine is dying. And there's no William Simon coming to save us this time. On June 9, 2024, a specific date that economists and global strategy experts had been watching for decades arrived. The silence was absolutely deafening. This date marked exactly 50 years since the William Simon Saudi Agreement. In the world of international diplomacy, 50 years is the standard length for secret treaties and confidentiality agreements. Everyone who understood how the petrodollar system worked expected that the United States and Saudi Arabia would renew their agreement. There should have been a big summit, a handshake, a public statement that the dollar was still supreme. But there was no summit. There was no handshake. Instead, Saudi Arabia quietly announced they were joining something called Project Enbridge, a digital currency system, created by international banks working with China, Hong Kong, Thailand, and the UAE. The petrodollar didn't die with a dramatic explosion. It died with a quiet software upgrade. The end of the 1974 deal isn't just symbolic. It's the actual dismantling of the U.S. dollar's monopoly on energy trading. For 50 years, the dollar had a unique advantage that no other currency could match. You absolutely had to own dollars to buy energy. This created guaranteed demand that let the Federal Reserve print trillions without major consequences. But today's reality in 2026 is that the United States is no longer at the center of energy trading. China is. China imports over 11 million barrels of oil every single day. Meanwhile, the U.S. actually produces more than it uses. The customer is always king, and the new king is Beijing. It makes zero economic sense for Saudi Arabia, the seller, and China, the buyer, to trade using the currency of a third party, the U.S., that's actively punishing both of them with sanctions. It creates exchange rate problems and political risks that neither country wants to deal with. This is why the petrol yuan was always going to happen. In recent years, we've witnessed the first historic trades where Saudi oil was bought using Chinese yuan instead of dollars. Critics say the yuan can't replace the dollar because it's not freely exchangeable, and China's capital controls prevent the Saudis from moving the money out of China. This is technically true, but it completely misses the point. The Saudis don't need to take the yuan out of China, they need to buy things from China. Just look at Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 project. They're building massive futuristic cities like Neom. Who's building the high-speed trains? China. Who's building the 5G cellular networks? Huawei. Who's building the solar power farms? Chinese construction companies. The petrodollar recycling loop from 1974, oil gives dollars gives U.S. bonds, is being replaced by the petrol yuan recycling loop of 2026, oil gives yuan gives Chinese infrastructure. The Saudis are trading black gold for steel, glass, and advanced technology. U.S. Treasury bonds are completely cut out of the cycle. But the most dangerous threat to the dollar isn't the yuan itself. It's the infrastructure of Project Enbridge. For 50 years, the U.S. enforced the petrodollar through SWIFT, the messaging network used by 11,000 banks worldwide to settle payments. Because SWIFT is basically controlled by Western countries, the U.S. could monitor every transaction and freeze any transaction it didn't approve of. Enbridge is a central bank digital currency platform that lets central banks trade directly with each other, peer-to-peer using blockchain technology. It completely bypasses the U.S. banking system. When Saudi Arabia sells oil to China using Enbridge, no American bank gets involved. No dollar transactions happen in New York. The U.S. government can't see the trade, can't sanction it, and can't stop it. It's a sanction-proof trading highway. This is the geopolitical bypass surgery that BRICS nations have been constructing. They haven't tried to beat the dollar head-on in direct combat. They've simply built a completely new road that goes around the battlefield. The implications of this shift for everyday Americans are absolutely terrifying, and most people have no clue it is happening. This is what economists call the Triffin dilemma working in reverse. For decades, the U.S. exported its inflation overseas. We printed dollars, sent them abroad to buy cheap stuff and oil, and those dollars stayed overseas in foreign bank vaults as reserves. This kept inflation out of America's domestic economy. But if the world doesn't need dollars to buy oil anymore, they have zero reason to keep hoarding them. What happens when Saudi Arabia, China, Brazil, and India decide to dump their massive dollar reserves? Those dollars come flooding back home. Trillions of dollars that have been sitting dormant overseas for 40 years will pour back into the U.S. economy, driving up prices for real stuff, real estate, farmland, companies. This will cause a massive, long-lasting spike in inflation that the Federal Reserve simply cannot fight. If the Fed raises interest rates to combat this inflation, they'll bankrupt the U.S. government, as I discussed in my Great Default video. If they print money to buy back the returning bonds, they'll make the inflation even worse. The special privilege becomes a crushing burden. The standard of living for average Americans, which was artificially boosted by the dollar's reserve currency status, will crash down to match what the country actually produces. Imported goods will become insanely expensive. The Walmart economy of dirt-cheap plastic products will come to an end. We're already seeing the global political realignment that proves this theory correct. Just look at the diplomatic schedule. In 2022, President Biden visited Saudi Arabia and got greeted with an awkward fist bump and a flat refusal to increase oil production. In 2023, Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Saudi Arabia and got welcomed with a royal ceremony complete with fighter jets painting the sky red and gold, plus the signing of $30 billion worth of investment deals. The visual message was crystal clear. The Saudi royal family knows that the U.S. is a fading empire with unreliable political commitment. They know China is a rising empire with an insatiable hunger for energy. They're acting as smart managers for their kingdom's future. They're diversifying their partnerships. They're not dumping the dollar overnight. That would destroy the value of their own massive dollar holdings. But they are systematically reducing their exposure. They're selling treasury bonds slowly while buying physical gold, as I covered in my Singapore Vault video. They're selling oil for yuan. They're joining the BRICS economic alliance. The death of the petrodollar means the death of America's unlimited credit card. Since 1974, Washington, D.C. has operated under the assumption that budget deficits don't matter because the world must lend us money. That assumption is now proven false. The bond market is starting to wake up to this harsh reality. Interest rates on long-term bonds are rising. Demand for long-term U.S. debt is disappearing. The bond auctions are getting messy. This isn't some temporary technical problem. It's a fundamental rejection of U.S. government debt. The world is saying, we won't fund your wars anymore. We won't fund your welfare programs. We won't fund your political battles. The 1974 deal was the dam holding back the flood of fiscal reality. That dam now has cracks. Water is trickling through. Soon the dam will completely break, and the U.S. will face a currency crisis that makes the 1970s look like a walk in the park. The cruel irony is that the U.S. actually sped up this process by weaponizing the dollar. By freezing Russia's dollar reserves in 2022, the U.S. proved to the Saudis that their reserves weren't actually safe. The Saudis looked at what happened to Russia and thought, if they can do it to a nuclear-armed superpower, they can definitely do it to us. That fear pushed them straight into China's welcoming arms. We used the weapon of sanctions so recklessly that we broke the weapon itself. Now we have no incentives and no threats left. All we have is mountains of debt. The era of the petrodollar was a 50-year abnormality in human history. We're returning to the historical average, and history shows that no paper currency survives forever, and no empire can print money forever and stay prosperous. The deal is finished. Oil is flowing to the east. Dollars are flowing back to the west. Get ready for the flood. The impact on everyday Americans. The unraveling of the 1974 Saudi deal isn't just some boring history lesson. It's the opening chapter of a nightmare for the American way of life. For 50 years, American citizens have lived inside an economic bubble. We've enjoyed a quality of life that's completely disconnected from what we actually produce. We consume far more than we make, and the difference has been paid for by the rest of the world accepting our paper money in exchange for their hard work, their natural resources, and their finished products. This was basically an invisible tax collected through the petrodollar system. When you went to Walmart and bought a $20 toaster made in China, that price was artificially cheap because China was deliberately weakening its own currency to collect dollars for buying oil. When you filled up your gas-guzzling SUV, the price was subsidized because the Saudis were reinvesting their oil profits into U.S. bonds, keeping our interest rates artificially low. Now imagine that subsidy completely disappearing. The death of the petrodollar means the end of imported cheap prices. As global demand for the dollar weakens, the dollar's value compared to foreign currencies and raw materials must fall. When the dollar falls, import prices skyrocket. That $20 toaster becomes $40. The cheap electronics, cheap clothing, cheap furniture, the entire material foundation of middle-class American lifestyle will be repriced to reflect the dollar's true value, which is way lower than its current level. This is what I call the Latin Americanization of the U.S. economy. We'll start looking more like Brazil or Argentina, a country with super-rich elites, struggling poor people, and a hollowed-out middle class fighting constant inflation. The Federal Reserve will be helpless to stop this because the inflation is uncaused by too much spending. It's caused by the currency losing value. Raising interest rates won't make the toaster cheaper if the dollar itself is losing global buying power. What this means for your investments, this fundamental shift forces a complete rethinking of retirement planning. The investment strategy that worked during the petrodollar era 1974-2024, the classic portfolio of 60% U.S. stocks and 40% U.S. bonds, is now financial suicide. U.S. bonds. Treasury securities are the investment most directly threatened by the end of the recycling loop. If the Saudis and Chinese are no longer automatically buying them, interest rates must rise to attract other investors. When rates rise, bond prices crash. Holding long-term U.S. government debt is betting that the petrodollar system will magically come back to life. It won't. U.S. stocks like the S&P 500 are mostly financial companies that benefited from 40 years of falling interest rates and cheap global labor. As rates climb and globalization breaks down, the profit margins of S&P 500 companies will shrink. So where should smart money go? It must flow into assets that benefit from the New World Order, scarcity, and independence. Investment number 1. Energy producers. If the petrodollar dies, oil doesn't become worthless. It becomes more valuable in dollar terms. Oil prices move opposite to dollar value. If the dollar crashes, oil prices explode upward. But you don't just want to own the oil commodity itself, you want to own the companies that produce it. Specifically, North American energy companies with huge long-term reserves. Why North American companies? Because in a fragmenting world, energy security equals national security. The U.S. government will eventually realize it must protect and encourage domestic production to survive. These companies own real physical assets. They control the stuff the world absolutely cannot function without. While tech companies trade at 30 times their earnings, energy companies trade at only 8 times earnings. This huge pricing gap will close as the market realizes you can't power AI data centers without electricity. Investment number 2, commodities and industrial metals. The green energy transition and the rebuilding of military supply chains both require massive quantities of copper, nickel, lithium, and uranium. The petroleum system is specifically designed to trade physical resources. BRICS nations are resource-rich. Western G7 nations are debt-rich. In a world running short on resources, the nations and companies that control actual physical materials hold all the power. This is the comeback of old-school industries. A copper mine in Chile is a more strategic investment in 2026 than a fancy software startup in Silicon Valley. Hard physical assets are the only protection against those trillions of overseas dollars returning home. Investment number 3, gold, the ultimate anti-dollar asset. We return to the main argument of this entire series. Gold is the only truly neutral reserve asset. When Saudi Arabia stops buying treasury bonds, what are they buying instead? We know the answer: gold. When China dumps dollars, what are they buying? Gold. Central banks worldwide are buying gold at the fastest pace since 1967, the last time the London gold pool collapsed. They're preparing for a world without dollar dominance. For individual investors, gold isn't an investment that pays interest or dividends. It's insurance against the complete change of the currency system. It's the only asset with zero counterparty risk. If the U.S. banking system freezes or the bond market locks up, gold still trades. It's the bridge that gets you across the default crisis. Investment number 4, defense and cybersecurity. It's an unfortunate truth throughout history that when empires lose their economic dominance, they often turn to military force to maintain their position. The loss of the petrodollar dramatically increases the risk of global war. The U.S. will likely shift to military-based economic stimulus, spending enormous amounts on defense to boost the economy and show strength. The defense industry is the one sector the government absolutely must fund, no matter how big the deficit gets. Additionally, as the global trade system fragments, cyber warfare becomes the main battlefield. Cybersecurity is basically the digital version of the defense industry. It's non-optional spending for every corporation and government on the planet. The final verdict, the Saudi deal of 1974, was a brilliant temporary solution to a permanent problem. It bought the United States 50 years of borrowed time. We used that time to consume, not to invest wisely. We built suburban sprawl, not factories. We built complex financial products, not energy infrastructure. Now the bill has arrived at our doorstep. The Great Reset isn't some evil conspiracy theory by global elites. It's the market's brutal correction of half a century of imbalances. The pendulum is swinging from west to east, from financial assets to real assets, from debt to ownership. The average American is completely unprepared for this massive swing. They're still using mental maps from the 1990s. They think inflation is temporary. They think the dollar is invincible. They're standing on train tracks, staring at the headlight of an approaching train, thinking it's a beautiful sunrise. It's not the sunrise. It's the Petroleum Express barreling toward them. Your job isn't to save the entire system. The system is beyond saving at this point. Your job is to protect your own household. This means getting completely out of debt. It means diversifying away from dollar-based assets. It means learning skills and acquiring assets that have real value in a world where money is no longer guaranteed to hold its worth. The secret handshake in the Saudi desert is over. The handshake that matters now is the one you make with reality itself. Don't bet against basic mathematics. The math clearly says the dollar is dying. Long live real assets.